A Japanese fighter was seconds away from delivering the killing shot. The American pilot had no options left. Every defensive move had failed. In pure desperation, he did something every instructor said would kill him instantly. He rolled his plane completely upside down and dove toward the ocean. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The P-38 Lightning shook violently as enemy bullets ripped through its metal skin. Lieutenant Richard Bong was flying alone at 18,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. His wingman was already falling toward the water below, leaving a trail of black smoke behind him. It was August 1943, and the hot sun was burning through the cockpit glass. Behind Bong, a Japanese Zero fighter was closing in fast. The enemy pilot was skilled and dangerous. He matched every move Bong made. Bong tried everything he had learned in training. He did barrel rolls, tight turns, and scissor maneuvers. Nothing worked. The Zero pilot countered each move easily. Now the Zero was less than 200 yards behind him, positioned perfectly for the killing shot. Bong's instrument panel was flashing warning lights. Oil pressure was dropping in the damaged engine. His plane was losing speed and altitude. In about 10 more seconds, the Zero's guns would finish him off. Bong was out of options. He was about to become another dead pilot in the Pacific War. Then, with death staring him in the face, Bong did something crazy. Something every instructor had warned would kill him instantly. He rolled his P-38 completely upside down and pushed the control stick forward hard. The Lightning's nose dropped toward the ocean in a screaming dive. But Bong was not diving normally. He was falling toward the Pacific upside down. Blood rushed into his skull so fast that his vision turned red. The instrument panel disappeared into a red blur. For 2 seconds that felt like forever, Richard Bong flew blind. His aircraft was experiencing negative G-forces that no training manual said it could survive. The P-38's twin engines screamed in protest. Loose equipment and empty bullet casings floated up from the cockpit floor and slammed into the canopy above his head. His oxygen mask felt like it was tearing off his face. Every blood vessel in his eyes felt ready to burst. When he finally rolled the aircraft right side up at 12,000 feet, having dropped 6,000 feet in those 2 terrifying seconds, the Zero was gone. Not just behind him. Gone completely. Vanished from the sky as if it had never existed. Bong circled carefully, scanning every part of the sky, but found nothing. The Japanese fighter that had been seconds away from killing him had simply disappeared. What Richard Bong did not know in that moment was that he had just accidentally discovered a maneuver that would change the entire Pacific Air War. A desperate, impossible, suicidal-looking trick that would break the Japanese Zero's reign of terror and help turn the tide of the war. Within months, what began as one terrified pilot's panic move would spread across every American airfield from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. This is the story of how American pilots learned to fly upside down to survive, and how that discovery transformed the deadliest aircraft in the Pacific. To understand why Bong's discovery was so revolutionary, you need to understand just how completely the Japanese Zero dominated the Pacific skies in 1942 and early 1943. When American pilots first met the Mitsubishi A6M Zero in combat, they could not believe what they were seeing. This Japanese fighter broke every assumption American military intelligence had made about enemy capabilities. The Zero could turn inside any Allied fighter with ease. It could climb faster, fly farther, and operate at higher altitudes than anything the Americans had. In the early battles over the Philippines, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese pilots flying Zeros were achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible. For every 3 Japanese aircraft shot down, the Allies were losing 9. In some battles, the ratio was even worse. The aircraft itself was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering. Designer Jiro Horikoshi had created a fighter that weighed just 3,700 pounds empty, compared to over 5,000 pounds for American fighters like the P-40 Warhawk. This weight savings came from radical design choices. The Zero had no armor plating to protect the pilot. The fuel tanks were unprotected, lacking the self-sealing technology that American aircraft had. The airframe itself was built to minimum stress tolerances, sacrificing durability for maneuverability. But in dogfighting performance, these sacrifices created a fighter that seemed supernatural. The Zero could complete a 360-degree turn in just under 16 seconds at combat speeds. An American P-40 required 23 seconds for the same maneuver. When two fighters merge in combat, 7 seconds might as well be an eternity. It meant that every time an American pilot tried to turn with a Zero, the Japanese fighter would complete its circle and end up on the American's tail with guns lined up for an easy kill. American pilots were dying by the dozens because they were trying to fight the Zero on its own terms. Fighter tactics in 1942 were still heavily influenced by World War I dogfighting doctrine. Pilots were taught to turn, to get inside the enemy's circle, to maneuver until they could bring their guns to bear. This worked beautifully against German fighters in Europe, which were heavier and less maneuverable than their Allied counterparts. But in the Pacific, this doctrine was a death sentence. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, one of the Navy's most innovative tacticians, watched his pilots die in training exercises against captured Zeros. He became obsessed with finding a solution. He spent weeks analyzing the Zero's capabilities and realized something crucial. Yes, the Zero could turn better than anything America had. Yes, it could climb faster. But the Zero's lightweight construction created vulnerabilities that could be exploited if American pilots stopped trying to turn with it. American fighters had advantages the Zero could not match. The P-38 Lightning, P-47 Thunderbolt, and F-4U Corsair all had more powerful engines that gave them superior speed in level flight and especially in dives. They had rugged construction that could survive battle damage that would tear a Zero apart. Their fuel systems were designed to tolerate violent maneuvering without starving the engines of fuel. And crucially, their pilots were protected by armor plating and reinforced cockpits. Thatch developed what became known as the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver where two American fighters would fly in coordination, protecting each other from Japanese attacks. It worked and it saved lives. But it required perfect coordination between wingmen and it was fundamentally defensive. It could help American pilots survive, but it did not give them a way to actually beat the Zero in combat. For that, they needed something else. Something that would come from desperation rather than tactical planning. The combat encounter that changed everything happened on April 7, 1943, over the Russell Islands and the Solomon's Chain. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, flying a P-38 Lightning, found himself in exactly the situation that had killed so many of his fellow pilots. 8 Japanese Zeros had bounced his flight from above. In the chaos of the initial merge, Lynch became separated from his wingmen. Now he was alone at 20,000 feet with multiple enemy fighters trying to maneuver onto his tail. Lynch was an experienced pilot, a pre-war veteran who had flown almost daily since Pearl Harbor. He knew the odds he was facing. He also knew that trying to turn with the Zeros would be suicide. His P-38 was faster than the enemy fighters, but they had altitude advantage. If he tried to simply run away in level flight, they would catch him before he could build up enough speed. He needed to break contact immediately, but every standard escape maneuver he knew required him to turn, which would let the Zeros close the distance even further. In that moment, Lynch made a decision that seemed insane. He rolled his P-38 completely inverted and pushed the stick forward, initiating a vertical dive while upside down. The world inverted around him. The ocean that had been below was now above. The sky that had been above was now below. The P-38, built like a tank compared to the fragile Zero, plunged toward the ocean at increasing speed, while Lynch's vision turned red from negative G-forces. What happened next stunned Lynch as much as it would later stun the Japanese pilots. The Zeros could not follow. When they tried to roll inverted and push into the dive to maintain pursuit, their lightweight airframes began to shudder and warp under the negative G-forces. Worse, their fuel systems, designed for positive G-forces during climbing and turning, could not handle the inverted pressure. Fuel stopped flowing to the engines. Carburetors starved. Some of the Zero engines simply quit entirely, leaving their pilots to glide helplessly while Lynch's P-38 screamed away at ever-increasing speed. Lynch did not just escape. At 12,000 feet, he rolled right side up, pulled back on the stick, and used his massive speed advantage to zoom back up to altitude. The Zeros, scattered and confused by his impossible maneuver, were now below him and slower. The hunter had become the hunted. Lynch dove on two of them from above, using his superior speed and the element of surprise. His .50 caliber machine guns converged on a Zero that never saw him coming. The Japanese fighter disintegrated under the hail of bullets. When Lynch returned to base and climbed out of his cockpit, his face was covered in small red dots. Burst blood vessels from the negative G-forces had created hundreds of tiny hemorrhages across his skin. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites almost completely red. He had a splitting headache that would last for 3 days. But he was alive. And he had just discovered something that would change everything. Lynch did not keep his discovery to himself. That evening, over drinks in the pilot's tent, he described exactly what he had done and what had happened. The younger pilots listened with a mixture of disbelief and fascination. Flying inverted was dangerous. Pushing into a dive while inverted was suicidal, or so they had been taught. But Lynch was standing there alive with 2 confirmed kills to show for it. And he insisted that the Zeros physically could not follow him through the maneuver. The physics of what Lynch had discovered were actually straightforward once you understood them. In normal flight, gravity pulls down on a pilot with 1 g of force. During a normal dive, pulling the stick back to curve downward creates positive G-forces, pressing the pilot down into his seat. Fighter pilots trained constantly to handle high positive Gs, learning to tense their muscles and control their breathing to maintain consciousness under forces that could reach 7 or 8 Gs in violent maneuvers. But an inverted dive created negative G-forces, pushing the pilot up out of his seat and forcing blood into his head instead of his legs. Human beings are poorly adapted to negative Gs. Even 2 or 3 negative Gs can cause unconsciousness in untrained pilots. The blood vessels in the eyes and face burst easily under the reversed pressure. Vision degrades rapidly as blood floods the retinas. It is an unpleasant, painful, disorienting experience. But the critical discovery was that while human pilots could train themselves to tolerate brief periods of negative G-force, aircraft fuel systems could not adapt. The Zero's carburetor was designed to work with fuel flowing down from tanks mounted above the engine. When the aircraft went inverted and then pushed into a dive, gravity suddenly pulled the fuel away from the carburetor intake. The engine would sputter, cough, and often quit entirely. The Zero pilot would find himself flying a glider while his American opponent accelerated away. American aircraft had a crucial technological advantage the Zero lacked. Many U.S. fighters, particularly the P-38 and later models of the P-47 and Corsair, used fuel injection systems rather than carburetors. Fuel injection could maintain consistent fuel delivery regardless of the aircraft's orientation. A P-38 could fly inverted for extended periods without the engines missing a beat. This seemingly minor technical difference suddenly became a life-or-death advantage in combat. The tactics spread through the American fighter squadrons, not through official channels, but through the informal network that fighter pilots have always relied on. When you were about to fly into combat where the slightest edge might keep you alive, you listened to veterans who had survived. And the veterans were increasingly all telling the same story. If a Zero gets on your tail, do not turn. Roll inverted and dive. The Zero cannot follow. Then use your speed to zoom back up and attack from advantage. Pilots started calling it different names. The split S when done from altitude. The inverted escape when used defensively. The negative G dive in formal debriefings. But informally among themselves, pilots called it going upside down on them, and it became the first thing experienced pilots told rookies arriving fresh from stateside training. The official training manual still warned against inverted flight as dangerous and disorienting. But in the Pacific, it was becoming standard procedure. Captain Robert de Haven of the 7th Fighter Squadron scored his first kill using the inverted dive in July 1943. A Zero had gotten behind him during a bomber escort mission near New Georgia. De Haven rolled inverted, pushed into the dive, and watched in his mirror as the Zero's engine quit trying to follow him. He recovered at 8,000 feet, climbed back up, and caught the Zero still trying to restart its engine. It was the easiest kill of his career. He would use the same tactic to score 13 more victories before the war ended. The physiological effects of the maneuver were brutal but survivable. Flight surgeons on Guadalcanal began keeping records of pilots who regularly performed inverted dives, and the data was both fascinating and disturbing. Nearly every pilot who used the tactic reported burst blood vessels in the eyes and face. Headaches lasting hours or even days were universal. Some pilots experienced temporary vision problems. A few lost consciousness briefly during the most violent negative G encounters. But none of that mattered because the alternative was death. Pilots would joke darkly that they would rather have a headache and red eyes than a posthumous medal. The flight surgeons documented the effects but made no attempt to discourage the tactic. They understood what the pilots understood. In air combat against the Zero, you needed every advantage you could find, and a few burst blood vessels were a cheap price to pay for survival. What made the inverted dive particularly devastating was that it completely reversed the tactical situation. Before this discovery, when a Zero got on an American fighter's tail, the American pilot was in serious trouble. His options were limited. His life expectancy measured in seconds. But once pilots mastered the inverted dive, suddenly it was the Zero pilot who was in trouble. The American would roll inverted and dive. The Zero could not follow. Within seconds the American was below with massive speed advantage. Then he would pull up in a zoom climb, using his momentum to rocket back above the Zero. Now he was in the perfect attack position with the sun behind him. Japanese pilots were completely unprepared for this tactical revolution. Their training emphasized turning combat, exploiting the Zero's magnificent maneuverability to get inside an opponent's circle. They had been taught that American fighters were heavy and clumsy, that they could not turn or climb, that they were easy prey if you could just get into a turning fight with them. None of their training addressed what to do when an American fighter suddenly rolled inverted and disappeared in a screaming dive that their Zeros could not follow. Japanese pilot Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, wrote about his confusion and frustration when he first encountered American pilots using the inverted dive. He described carefully maneuvering into position behind a P-38, lining up for what should have been an easy kill, only to watch in disbelief as the American rolled completely upside down and dove away. When Sakai tried to follow, his Zero's engine sputtered and quit, forcing him to break off the attack while his opponent escaped. What frustrated Sakai even more was that the Americans would then immediately climb back up and attack from above, using their superior speed and the altitude advantage they had gained in the dive. The tactical situation had been completely reversed in just a few seconds. The hunter had become the hunted, and there was nothing Sakai or his fellow Zero pilots could do about it except avoid getting into tailchase situations in the first place. By late 1943, the inverted dive had evolved from desperate survival tactic to deliberate combat strategy. American squadron commanders were teaching it openly now, despite the fact that official doctrine still frowned on inverted flight. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 475th Fighter Group, told his pilots bluntly in their mission briefings, "If you try to turn with a Zero, you die. If you try to climb with a Zero, you die. Roll inverted, dive, use your speed, and attack from above. That is how you survive. That is how you win." The P-38 Lightning proved particularly effective at exploiting the inverted dive because of its unique twin-boom design. The aircraft's distinctive shape made it instantly recognizable, and Japanese pilots learned to be wary when they saw the twin-boom's silhouette. P-38 pilots developed a reputation for aggressiveness and unpredictability. They would deliberately bait Zeros into tail chases, then use the inverted dive to escape and reverse the situation. It became a cat-and-mouse game, but now the Americans were increasingly the cats. Captain Thomas Maguire, who would eventually become the second highest scoring American ace of the war with 38 victories, used the inverted dive to devastating effect over the Philippines in 1944. In one engagement over Leyte Gulf, he deliberately slowed his P-38 to entice a Zero into attacking position. When the Japanese pilot took the bait and closed to firing range, Maguire rolled inverted and dove. The Zero pilot attempted to follow and his aircraft literally came apart in midair under the negative G stress. The wings folded upward, the lightweight airframe collapsed, and the Zero tumbled into the ocean in pieces. Maguire had not even needed to fire his guns. The tactic worked with other American fighters too, though the technique required modifications for different aircraft. The F-4U Corsair, with its massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine, could perform inverted dives that were even more violent than the P-38s. Corsair pilots learned to roll inverted and simply let the aircraft's weight and power carry them down in screaming vertical dives that no Zero could hope to follow. Marine Corps pilots flying Corsairs from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal used the inverted dive to rack up impressive kill ratios against Japanese fighters that had previously seemed unbeatable. The P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug because of its barrel-shaped fuselage, was the heaviest of the American single-engine fighters. That weight was a disadvantage in turning combat, but it became a massive advantage in diving. P-47 pilots could roll inverted and dive so fast that they approached the speed of sound, reaching velocities where the aircraft's controls became sluggish and dangerous. But Japanese fighters could not come close to matching these speeds, and P-47 pilots exploited their weight advantage ruthlessly. By 1944, the tactical situation in the Pacific had completely reversed. Kill ratios that had once favored the Japanese were now running heavily in favor of the Americans. For every American fighter shot down, the U.S. was destroying 3, 4, sometimes 5 Japanese aircraft. The Zero, which had once ruled the Pacific skies with impunity, was now increasingly a liability rather than an asset. Its lightweight design and lack of protection, which had made it so maneuverable, also made it fragile and vulnerable to American tactics that exploited its weaknesses. Japan desperately tried to counter the American tactical evolution. Engineers developed new fighters like the J-2M Raiden and the Ki-84 He-8 with more powerful engines and better high-speed handling. But these aircraft arrived too late and in too few numbers to make a difference. Even these improved fighters could not match the diving performance of American aircraft or maintain engine power during negative G maneuvers. The fundamental physics that made the inverted dive effective could not be engineered away quickly enough to matter. More critically, Japan was losing its experienced pilots at a catastrophic rate. The men who had dominated the early years of the Pacific War were dead, shot down over the Solomons, over New Guinea, above the Philippines. The replacement pilots being thrown into combat had minimal training, sometimes fewer than 100 flight hours before they faced American veterans who had survived dozens or even hundreds of combat missions. These inexperienced Japanese pilots stood no chance against Americans who knew how to exploit every advantage their aircraft offered. Richard Bong, the pilot whose desperate accident in August 1943 had started it all, went on to become America's highest-scoring ace with 40 confirmed victories. He refined the inverted dive into an art form, often deliberately baiting Japanese fighters into attacking positions just so he could demonstrate the maneuver. Other pilots would watch his gun camera footage in amazement as he calmly rolled inverted, dove away from pursuing Zeros, then climbed back up and destroyed his confused opponents from above. The tactic's effectiveness was not limited to fighter-versus-fighter combat. American bomber pilots adopted modified versions of the inverted dive to escape Japanese fighters that attacked their formations. While a fully loaded bomber could not perform the violent negative G maneuvers that fighters could, bomber pilots learned that rolling partially inverted and diving could still break lock from pursuing Zeros long enough for defensive gunners to get clear shots. Dozens of bomber crews credited this tactic with saving their lives when Japanese fighters tried to press home attacks. The psychological impact of the inverted dive on Japanese pilots was perhaps as important as its tactical effectiveness. Fighter combat is as much about confidence and morale as it is about technology and tactics. In early 1943, Japanese pilots had been supremely confident, secure in the knowledge that their Zeros could outturn and outclimb anything the Americans had. By late 1943, that confidence was shattered. Japanese pilots knew that if they committed to attacking an American fighter, there was a good chance their opponent would simply roll inverted and escape, then return from above with all the advantages. The psychological edge had shifted entirely to the Americans. The inverted dive's influence extended far beyond World War II. After the war, fighter tactics instructors analyzed what had worked in the Pacific and incorporated those lessons into training doctrine. The split S maneuver, essentially a formalized version of the inverted dive, became a standard part of fighter pilot training. Pilots flying jets in Korea used variations of the tactic against MiG-15s. In Vietnam, American pilots facing agile Soviet-built fighters rediscovered that diving away from turning combat and using speed and altitude to dictate engagement terms was still the key to survival and victory. The Navy's Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun, was established in 1969 specifically to teach American pilots how to fight outnumbered against agile opponents. The curriculum emphasized many of the same principles that pilots had discovered fighting Zeros in the Pacific. Use your aircraft's strengths. Avoid fighting on your opponent's terms. Exploit speed and energy rather than trying to outturn more maneuverable fighters. The lessons learned over the Solomon Islands in 1943 were still being taught to F-14 and F-18 pilots decades later. Thomas Lynch, the pilot who had turned Bong's accident into a deliberate tactic, did not survive the war. He was shot down and killed over the Philippines in March 1944, not in air-to-air combat, but by anti-aircraft fire while strafing Japanese positions at low altitude. He was 27 years old. The inverted dive could not protect against ground fire, and Lynch died doing exactly what he had taught his squadron to do: press the attack, take risks, and never give the enemy a chance to recover. His Medal of Honor citation credited him with 12 confirmed victories and praised his innovative tactical leadership. The inverted dive represented something profound about how wars are actually won. It was not a product of careful planning by generals or innovative designs by engineers. It was discovered accidentally by a desperate pilot doing something everyone had told him was impossible. It was refined through trial and error by men who had to learn fast or die. And it spread not through official channels, but through the informal networks that connect people facing the same deadly challenges. It worked because it exploited fundamental physics that no amount of Japanese engineering could overcome. The story also reveals how narrow the line between victory and defeat can be in aerial combat. The Zero was genuinely an outstanding aircraft, and in the hands of experienced pilots, it was absolutely lethal. But it had vulnerabilities that could be exploited if opposing pilots could just figure out how. For more than a year, American pilots died by the hundreds because they could not crack the puzzle. Then Richard Bong rolled inverted in a moment of desperation, survived by accident, and suddenly the puzzle was solved. The Zero had not changed. American aircraft had not changed. But the tactics had changed, and that made all the difference. Today, a restored P-38 Lightning sits in the National Museum of World War II Aviation in Colorado Springs. The aircraft, painted in the colors of Richard Bong's plane, still bears the name Marge after Bong's fiancée. Next to it, museum curators have placed an information placard that describes the inverted dive and its role in turning the tide of the Pacific Air War. Visitors can look at that graceful twin-boomed fighter and imagine what it must have taken to roll that aircraft inverted 18,000 feet above the ocean and push into a dive that seemed certain to end in death. The Japanese Zero fighters that once dominated the Pacific are now museum pieces too. Restored examples are displayed in aviation museums around the world. They are beautiful aircraft, elegant and purposeful in their design. Standing next to one, you can see exactly what made them so deadly and why American pilots feared them. But you can also see the lightweight construction, the thin aluminum skin, the minimal structure. Looking at a Zero with the knowledge of history, you can understand why this magnificent fighter could not follow American planes through the inverted dive that broke its dominance. The lesson of the inverted dive extends beyond aviation history into every field where innovation matters. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem comes not from better equipment or more resources, but from someone desperate enough to try something everyone says will not work. Richard Bong was not supposed to survive that August day in 1943. He did something that violated every rule and every procedure. But he survived. And in surviving, he handed American pilots the key to defeating an enemy that had seemed unbeatable. The story is a reminder that in warfare, in technology, in any competitive endeavor, the advantage does not always go to whoever has the best equipment. It goes to whoever figures out how to use their equipment most effectively. The Zero was probably the better dogfighter right up until the end of the war. But American pilots learned not to dogfight. They learned to roll inverted, dive away, and use physics as their ally. They learned to fight on their terms rather than the enemy's terms. That lesson, born in desperation over the Solomon Islands, remains relevant in any conflict where opponents are evenly matched. Richard Bong survived the Pacific War with more aerial victories than any other American pilot. But he did not survive the peace. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Bong was killed testing a new P-80 jet fighter in California. He was 24 years old. The irony of the timing was not lost on those who knew him. The man who had pioneered the tactic that helped win the Pacific Air War died on the day that ensured the war would end. He never got to see the full impact of what his desperate improvisation in August 1943 had accomplished. But his legacy lived on in the hundreds of pilots who survived the war because they had learned to fly upside down when they needed to. In the restored P-38s that fly at air shows today, occasionally performing the split-S maneuver that Bong pioneered. In the fighter pilot training programs that still teach the same fundamental principle, use your strengths, avoid your opponent's strengths, and never be afraid to do something that seems crazy if it might keep you alive. The inverted dive, born from one pilot's terror and desperation, became a piece of tactical wisdom that would outlive everyone who fought in the war that created it. The Japanese Zero was unstoppable until one American pilot accidentally discovered something that changed everything. That discovery was not a new weapon or a better aircraft. It was simply the willingness to fly upside down when every instinct and every training manual said it would kill you. Sometimes that is all it takes to turn the tide of history. One person desperate enough to try the impossible and lucky enough to survive it. The sky above the Pacific looks peaceful now. But for those who know the history, every cloud formation and every patch of blue carries the memory of young men who learned to fly upside down to stay alive. Their story reminds us that innovation often comes not from comfort and planning, but from desperation and the refusal to accept that defeat is inevitable. Richard Bong rolled inverted that August day because he had no other choice. In doing so, he changed the course of a war and created a legacy that continues to influence fighter tactics more than 80 years later. That is the power of one desperate moment, one impossible decision, and one pilot brave enough or terrified enough to try something that everyone said could not be done.